before the ink dried on the first European map, before a single flag was planted, before America had a name, there were people walking these lands, brown like the soil, copper like blood in sunlight. They weren't visitors, they weren't migrants, they were the original Americans. And many of them didn't look the way most were taught to imagine. They were darker, broader, some with thick, coiled hair, others with deep-set eyes and reddish-brown skin, like carved mahogany or sun-dried clay. Some had the features now described as African, but their bones told a different story: native, indigenous to this soil, sovereigns in a land that would later pretend they never existed. In the 1500s, when the Spanish first stepped into Florida and along the Gulf Coast, they met people who confounded their scribes, dark-skinned natives, some speaking Muscogean tongues, some adorned in copper and feathers, others dressed in animal skins and shells. Not African slaves, not Moors, but Native Americans who looked like no European had expected. By the 1600s, English, French, and Dutch explorers began recording encounters with native peoples described as black as Ethiopians, or Negro-like, but with Indian tongue. They didn't fit into Europe's neat racial boxes, so new ones were made. Labels like Blackamoor Indian, Negro Indian, and later, just Negro, slowly replaced tribal names in journals, census rolls, and treaties. These weren't isolated incidents. The Gwale, Yamasee, Washita, Muskogee, and Gullah-connected tribes were vast, complex societies, mound builders, spiritualists, warriors, and stewards of the southeastern woodlands. Their towns stretched across what we now call Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and the Carolinas. But as colonizers took root, these indigenous nations were systematically reclassified. Their languages were suppressed, their names replaced, and their children, when captured or traded, were labeled Negro, regardless of tribal blood. This was not just war. This was relabeling warfare, a bureaucratic cleansing, and its most devastating weapon was not the gun, but the quill. By the 1700s, America began separating who counted as Indian by phenotype and politics. The darker you were, the more likely you were written out of your own ancestry. The 5 civilized tribes, Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, were pressured into adopting European ideas of race and slavery. They were told to distance themselves from their darker kin to gain status with the United States. And so, the division was sown from within. By the late 1800s, many tribal nations were being infiltrated, not by force, but by paperwork. Mixed-race whites and non-natives with no ancestral connection to any tribe began falsely claiming indigenous identity during the land allotment process under the Dawes Act of 1887. For a fee, often reported as $5, they could be enrolled on tribal rolls as Indians, despite lacking blood ties or cultural connection. These individuals came to be known as $5 Indians. This scheme wasn't just about identity, it was about access. With enrollment came land, tax exemptions, rations, and political power. Meanwhile, many true tribal descendants, especially those of darker skin tone or those previously reclassified as freedmen or colored, were left off the rolls entirely. In many cases, it was those who looked black or who were connected to enslaved ancestry, despite full tribal belonging, who were removed or denied recognition altogether. A system that once protected sovereignty became a weapon of paper genocide. What began as survival tactics during colonial expansion was manipulated into a system of erasure. In 1824, the U.S. formalized its control over tribal affairs with the creation of the Office of Indian Affairs, then a division of the Department of War. The same institution that carried out military campaigns against native nations now controlled their treaties, identity classifications, and even the criteria for Indianness. By then, many Eastern tribes had already been scattered, removed, or fragmented, especially those with members who were dark-skinned indigenous people, now labeled freedmen. Despite fighting in wars, preserving culture, and maintaining towns, these communities were written out of tribal records, their stories buried beneath plantation myths, or erased in schoolbooks. If they didn't meet the government's image of a real Indian, light enough, recognizable enough, they were omitted from enrollment rolls. Only those who looked Indian enough or could prove proximity to political leadership were allowed to remain native on paper. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, westward expansion brought Americans face to face with the Plains tribes: Lakota, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Apache, Arapaho. These were the Red Indians, immortalized in dime novels and westerns. Horseback warriors, spiritual defenders of open plains. Because their culture was more visibly intact and geographically isolated from early colonial centers, their tribal identities were harder to erase at first. But even among these nations, those with black ancestry were marginalized, excluded from official status, or classified as freedmen, even when they had equal tribal rights by blood and tradition. Many were removed from tribal roles, sent to Indian boarding schools designed to kill the Indian, save the man, or outright reclassified based on appearance. By the late 1800s and into the early 1900s, as U.S. racial segregation hardened under Jim Crow, a final strategy emerged: relabeling. If your skin was too dark, you were no longer Indian. You were now African American, even if your people had been indigenous to this land for thousands of years. If your features were too red, but your documentation lacked recognition, you were now called Mexican, even if you'd never crossed the southern border. This racial engineering fractured families. One sibling might be recognized as Choctaw or Muskogee. Another, equally native by birth, might be denied all rights and classified as black. Another, exiled and renamed Mexican. Still others, nothing at all. Entire bloodlines erased. A century of memory lost to bureaucracy and ink. But the land does not forget. The mounds still rise. The rivers still whisper names long scratched from government ledgers. The earth still holds what the paper tried to bury. In the face of this erasure, black native communities rebuilt. They formed towns like Greenwood, Tulsa, Boley, and Rosewood, rooted in ancestral law and cultural resilience. They preserved language in secret, danced in hidden gatherings, and passed down names that no enrollment agent could erase. Red tribes fought back as well, against land theft, broken treaties, and cultural extermination. But both groups lost generations to paperwork, silence, and imposed labels. Today, we walk on land divided by strangers' maps. One half of a family labeled red, the other black, but both walked this land first. Both carry truths deeper than any census box or roll number. If you were ever told your grandmother was Indian, but couldn't find her on the rolls, this story is yours. If you've ever looked in the mirror and seen copper, clay, or cedar in your skin, this story is yours. If you were taught that Native people vanished, or that black people all came from ships, this story is yours to reclaim. If this story spoke to something buried in your family, if you've heard whispers of Native blood, but found only silence in the records, or if you've seen your history misnamed, mislabeled, or erased, then it's time to rise. Subscribe to the channel for more untold truths. Drop a comment if this story matches your bloodline or your family's journey. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because the truth won't spread unless we speak it. And if you're searching for your roots, keep digging. The paper might lie, but the land, the blood, and the bones do not. They tried to erase us, but now we write ourselves back in. Until next time, stay rooted, stay rising.